June 29, 1974, Darmstadt, West Germany. On the worn oak desk of Admiral Karl Dönitz lay an open book, the ultra-secret, the recently released memoir that had just begun circulating through German bookstores. The 83-year-old former commander of the U-boat fleet, and the last Führer of the Third Reich, sat in silence as his aide translated the words from English into German. Each line struck like a blow. From May 1940 onwards, the passage read, "We were reading the communications of the German Army, Navy, and Air Force almost as swiftly as the Germans themselves." Dönnitz's hands, aged and trembling, tightened on the edges of the book. The revelation stripped away everything he had believed for 3 decades. For years, he had attributed Germany's catastrophic submarine losses to Allied radar, superior industrial output, and technological innovation. But this was far worse. Every order he had transmitted to his fleet, every tactical experiment, every desperate attempt to seize control of the Atlantic had been intercepted and deciphered by British intelligence, often before his own officers received the commands. His aide later recalled that the old admiral's face went ashen. The words before him were not simply history. They were a quiet indictment of everything he had built. In the days that followed, Dönitz would write to the publisher, attempting a feeble defense. "I had always suspected this," he claimed, but even to those who had served him, the protest rang hollow. During the war, subordinates who dared raise concerns about the security of Enigma had been dismissed. "It cannot be broken," he had insisted with the certainty of a man who believed his machines were infallible. Now, in his modest post-war apartment near Hamburg, the weight of the truth pressed upon him. 783 submarines gone, 30,000 sailors entombed beneath the Atlantic. All lost because the encryption system he had trusted, without question, had been compromised since 1940. The unbreakable Enigma, his Navy's lifeline, had not only failed, it had betrayed them. The staggering mathematics behind its complexity, the astronomical number of theoretical combinations, had meant nothing against the ingenuity of Polish mathematicians, British cryptanalysts, and the primitive electronic computers he never even knew existed. Every coded signal, every strategic plan, every whispered hope had been laid bare to the enemy. German confidence in Enigma had been absolute. The standard 3-rotor machine used by the Wehrmacht offered 17,576 possible rotor positions, multiplied by 60 possible rotor arrangements, over 1 million potential configurations. And when the plugboard settings were included, the total rose to 158,962,555,217,826,360,00. Numbers so vast that they seemed to defy human comprehension. Dr. Erich Hutton, who led the cipher department of the OKW Chi Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Chief, had testified after the war that he had indeed considered the theoretical possibility of breaking Enigma, but only as a mathematical curiosity. It would, he believed, require resources and time that no nation could possibly spare. His calculations suggested that even if an adversary possessed a machine, without the daily changing keys, they could never reconstruct a single day's settings before the next ones went into effect. The German Navy had gone even further in their security discipline. Dönitz personally oversaw the strictest cryptographic training in the armed forces. Naval radio operators were schooled at the Marine Nachrichtenschule in Flensburg, where months of training drilled into them not only operation of the machine, but the rituals of destruction in the face of capture. Codebooks were printed on pink paper and water-soluble red ink, designed to dissolve within seconds if submerged. Weighted pouches ensured materials would sink immediately if thrown overboard. U-boat captains were ordered to execute any crewman who hesitated to destroy encryption materials in the event of imminent capture, and still, the Allies had read them all. In February 19, the Navy introduced its ultimate defense, the 4-rotor Enigma, codenamed Triton by the Germans, Shark by the Allies. With 8 rotors to choose from, rather than 5, and an additional rotor to multiply complexity, the system seemed beyond comprehension. German cryptographers even conducted an internal experiment, Project 100, the 100 Days Project, attempting to break their own cipher. After 3 complete failures, Vice Admiral Erhard Mertens assured Dönitz, "Our cipher remains secure." Yet, almost from that very moment, signs of disaster began to appear. Throughout 1941 and 1942, Allied forces achieved a series of impossible interceptions. Convoys ambushed far from known patrols. Supply ships destroyed in vast empty seas where no reconnaissance could have found them by chance. Each time, German analysts explained the events away. Radar, better aircraft, blind luck. anything but the possibility that their communications had been compromised. Between March and June 1941, 7 of 9 German supply ships stationed across the Atlantic were located and destroyed. The odds of such coincidence were mathematically near zero. But when Captain Ludwig Stummel of the BDenst Intelligence Division investigated, his report concluded that the British must have developed superior radar. The alternative, that they were reading position reports, was never entertained. Even the destruction of the Bismarck in May 1941 did not break the illusion. Luftwaffe General Hans Jaschonnek, confronted with evidence that British aircraft had somehow located the ship in the vast Atlantic, brushed aside all doubts. "It is impossible that the enemy reads our ciphers," he declared. "Our specialists have proven this beyond any doubt." By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned into a slaughter. U-boat losses mounted month after month despite new tactics, better torpedoes, and improved submarines. Dönitz himself, writing in his diary in early 1942, could not understand how Allied forces kept finding his boats in the open ocean. Each time he asked for explanations, the answer came back the same: radar, aircraft, luck, but never cryptography. And still, the losses mounted. The war at sea was being lost long before Admiral Dönitz realized it. Even as the U-boats prowled the Atlantic in greater numbers than ever before, invisible hands were guiding their destruction. The British were not guessing, they were reading. The first cracks in Germany's illusion of security appeared in 1941. After the capture of the submarine U-570, on August 27, south of Iceland, the vessel was forced to the surface by a British Hudson bomber. To the disbelief of both sides, her captain surrendered his crew alive, his submarine largely intact, and, most disastrously, her encryption materials potentially preserved. German investigators at the Naval Intelligence Service were quick to respond. Captain Ludwig Stummel, a meticulous officer and cryptographic expert, led the inquiry. His October report was thorough, precise, and completely wrong. He acknowledged that if the British had indeed recovered the submarine's Enigma machine and codebooks intact, they might theoretically read German naval traffic. But he dismissed the idea almost immediately. His reasoning was elegantly circular, since security protocols required the destruction of all cryptographic material before capture. It must have been done. Therefore, compromise was impossible. "Our cipher cannot be broken," he concluded. What Stummel could not know was that another submarine, U-110, had already been captured 3 months earlier. On May 9, 1941, the destroyer HMS Bulldog and her boarding party had found the submarine's radio room intact, the Enigma machine still warm. Codebooks spread across the desk. Within days, British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park were reading German naval signals, those precious documents, the Kurzsignale codebooks, and the officer-only communication settings provided the key to unraveling the entire system. The victory was so complete that the British classified it under the highest level of secrecy, hiding it even from their own commanders under the codename Ultra. Over the following year, Dönitz and his staff would launch repeated investigations into the inexplicable precision of Allied counteractions. But each time, their logic circled back to the same comforting conclusion: Enigma was mathematically invulnerable. By 1943, U-boat losses had become catastrophic. Convoys were turning into traps. The Atlantic had become a graveyard of steel. Still, the German Naval High Command refused to believe the problem was within. After the spring massacres of 1943, later called Black May, Dönitz ordered the most exhaustive security review of the war. Corvette Captain Meckel, one of his most capable officers, led the investigation. The team examined every conceivable factor: equipment malfunctions, radar emissions, atmospheric conditions, human error. The first theory centered on the METOX radar detectors installed on U-boat. These devices, meant to detect Allied radar, might, the scientists speculated, be re-radiating signals that revealed the submarine's positions. Tests confirmed the suspicion. A German Focke-Wulf Condor aircraft detected a METOX signal from more than 100 kilometers away. The order came swiftly: disable all detectors immediately. But the losses continued. Next came the theory that Allied planes were using infrared detection, spotting the heat signatures of diesel engines. Naval engineers rushed to produce special paints that absorbed infrared light, coating returning submarines in experimental matte finishes. Yet the sinkings did not slow. Then, in February 1943, a British bomber crashed near Rotterdam, carrying something extraordinary: a fully intact H-2S radar system. The captured device revealed that the British had moved to centimetric radar, operating on frequencies that German detectors could not even register. Shocked, German scientists launched yet another emergency program to develop new counter-radar devices. By September, the Naxos radar detectors were deployed to U-boats, but by then, the war in the Atlantic was already lost. Throughout all of these frantic efforts, one explanation remained conspicuously absent: the possibility that the Allies were reading their messages. The assumption of enigmas and vulnerability had become a kind of religion. Vice Admiral Hartigan, Meertens, chief of naval intelligence, summed up the mindset in his 1941 memorandum. Breaking Enigma, he wrote, would require a perfect chain of miracles. The enemy would need to capture intact machines, seize the current keys, reconstruct the cryptographic protocols, and process the information before the daily settings changed. Taken together, he concluded, these conditions are impossible. Ironically, while Germany dismissed the idea that its own codes could be broken, it celebrated its success in breaking those of others. The Bedienst, under Captain Heinz Bombe, had penetrated British naval cipher No. 3, the code used for Allied convoy communications. By late 1942, German cryptanalyst Wilhelm Trano could read up to 80% of intercepted British messages within hours of transmission. Dönitz considered this proof that Germany's cryptographic discipline was unmatched. But that success became their undoing. While the Germans pored over British convoy routes, the Allies were reading the orders that directed the U-boats themselves. Every triumph at Bedienst fed Dönitz's confidence and ensured his blindness. By the spring of 1943, Bletchley Park had fully mastered the four-order Enigma, thanks to codebooks retrieved from the sinking U-559, whose crew drowned, saving them. With that breakthrough, the British resumed reading German naval traffic almost in real time. The results were devastating. Dönitz had amassed the largest submarine fleet in history, minus 116 U-boats patrolling the Atlantic and wolf packs with names like Falk, MCU, and Sturmer. He believed victory was within reach. In his diary of May 1, 1943, he wrote, "The enemy is weakening. One more effort, and Britain's lifeline will be severed." But the British already knew everything. Convoy OS-5 departed Liverpool for Halifax on April 28, 1943, consisted of 42 merchant ships and was quickly spotted by U-600. Dönitz ordered 41 submarines to converge for the attack. Reading his signals, the British reinforced the convoy and rerouted additional escorts. The battle raged for 6 days across hundreds of miles. 13 merchant ships were lost, but at the cost of 7 others followed. U-192, depth charged by HMS Lut, U-638, ran by HMS Sunflower, U-125, U-531, U-438, U-630, U-528, all gone. For the first time in the war, the Allies were sinking submarines faster than the Germans could build them. By mid-May, the slaughter had become systematic. Convoys HX-237 and SC-130 destroyed 8 U-boats without losing a single ship. Hunter-killer groups guided by ultra-intercepts swept across the North Atlantic, catching U-boats at refueling points and along their approach routes. Aircraft equipped with new lee lights exposed submarines surfacing at night, while ships armed with hedgehog mortar decimated them underwater. The results were catastrophic. In May alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed, nearly a quarter of the fleet. Dönitz, recognizing the futility, issued the order that marked the end of the Battle of the Atlantic. All submarines were to withdraw from the North Atlantic and regroup farther south. In his war diary, he wrote simply, "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic." He blamed radar, he blamed aircraft, he blamed the weather, but never, not once, did he blame Enigma. Even as the wreckage of his fleet sank beneath the Atlantic waves, the thought that his own communications had orchestrated their deaths never crossed his mind. The most astonishing part of the Enigma story is not that the Allies broke it, but that they managed to keep it secret. For 5 years, Britain had access to the deepest thoughts of its enemies, yet acted with such restraint and precision that Germany never suspected. Winston Churchill, who received daily briefings from Bletchley Park, called the operation the goose that laid the golden eggs but never cackled. He understood that its power lay not merely in what was known, but in how carefully that knowledge was used. If the Germans ever realized that Enigma had been compromised, the war's greatest advantage would vanish overnight. Thus, the preservation of Ultra, the codename for all intelligence derived from broken Enigma traffic, became a second, silent war. Group Captain Frederick Winterboth, working under the direction of CIS Chief Stuart Menzies, designed an intricate system of secrecy and control. Beginning in 1940, a network known as the Special Liaison Units (SLUs) was formed. Small, hand-picked teams responsible for delivering ultra-intelligence to field commanders. Each officer was personally vetted by Winterbotham, sworn under the Official Secrets Act, and warned that a single breach, even after the war, would mean prosecution for treason. To most of the British military, Ultra didn't exist. Messages arrived in sealed envelopes marked only from a highly secret source. Even the recipients were forbidden to speculate where the intelligence came from. At Bletchley Park itself, paranoia was institutionalized. The sprawling estate, now a quiet museum, was then a fortress of secrecy. Military police guarded every gate. Inside, over 9,000 men and women worked in total compartmentalization. Mathematicians, engineers, and typists, each performing a small, isolated task without ever glimpsing the full picture. In Hut 8, where naval Enigma was attacked under Alan Turing's direction, no one knew what was being done in Hut 6, which worked on Wehrmacht traffic. Even inside each hut, people were restricted to their specific function: decrypting, translating, or filing, never combining the parts. Many of the young women operating the bomb machines believed they were working on weather data or statistical research. To shield Ultra's existence, the British created layers of deception so convincing that even years later, some Allied officers still believed them. The earliest cover story was the invention of a mythical spy network known as Bombe. According to this fiction, an anti-Nazi German officer in Berlin was providing Britain with a steady stream of secret documents. The story was used so consistently that even senior military leaders referred to our man Boniface without irony. When the British acted on ultra-intelligence, they staged elaborate performances to make discoveries appear accidental. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately flown along routes that coincided with targets already revealed by giving the impression that the attacks resulted from aerial spotting rather than code breaking. After the British used Ultra to destroy an Italian convoy in the Mediterranean, they sent a radio message in a code they knew the Germans could read, thanking a brave agent in Naples for the information. The fictitious spy received many such acknowledgments throughout the war. But the deception wasn't just about fake stories, it was about restraint. Commanders were explicitly ordered not to act on ultra-intelligence unless a plausible cover existed. If an enemy convoy could not be attacked without exposing the secret, it was allowed to pass. This discipline was absolute, sometimes heartbreakingly so. By 1943, U-boat losses had become catastrophic. Convoys were turning into traps. The Atlantic had become a graveyard of steel. Still, the German Naval High Command refused to believe the problem was within. After the spring massacres of 1943, later called Black May, Dönitz ordered the most exhaustive security review of the war. Corvette Captain Meckel, one of his most capable officers, led the investigation. The team examined every conceivable factor: equipment malfunctions, radar emissions, atmospheric conditions, human error. The first theory centered on the METOX radar detectors installed on U-boat. These devices, meant to detect Allied radar, might, the scientists speculated, be re-radiating signals that revealed the submarines' positions. Tests confirmed the suspicion. A German Focke-Wulf Condor aircraft detected a METOX signal from more than 100 kilometers away. The order came swiftly: disable all detectors immediately. But the losses continued. Next came the theory that Allied planes were using infrared detection, spotting the heat signatures of diesel engines. Naval engineers rushed to produce special paints that absorbed infrared light, coating returning submarines in experimental matte finishes. Yet the sinkings did not slow. Then, in February 1943, a British bomber crashed near Rotterdam, carrying something extraordinary: a fully intact H-2S radar system. The captured device revealed that the British had moved to centimetric radar, operating on frequencies that German detectors could not even register. Shocked, German scientists launched yet another emergency program to develop new counter-radar devices. By September, the Naxos radar detectors were deployed to U-boats, but by then, the war in the Atlantic was already lost. Throughout all of these frantic efforts, one explanation remained conspicuously absent: the possibility that the Allies were reading their messages. The assumption of enigmas and vulnerability had become a kind of religion. Vice Admiral Hartigan, Meertens, Chief of Naval Intelligence, summed up the mindset in his 1941 memorandum. Breaking Enigma, he wrote, would require a perfect chain of miracles. The enemy would need to capture intact machines, seize the current keys, reconstruct the cryptographic protocols, and process the information before the daily settings changed. Taken together, he concluded, these conditions are impossible. Ironically, while Germany dismissed the idea that its own codes could be broken, it celebrated its success in breaking those of others. The Bedienst, under Captain Heinz Bombe, had penetrated British naval cipher No. 3, the code used for Allied convoy communications. By late 1942, German cryptanalyst Wilhelm Trano could read up to 80% of intercepted British messages within hours of transmission. Dönitz considered this proof that Germany's cryptographic discipline was unmatched. But that success became their undoing. While the Germans pored over British convoy routes, the Allies were reading the orders that directed the U-boats themselves. Every triumph at Bedienst fed Dönitz's confidence and ensured his blindness. By the spring of 1943, Bletchley Park had fully mastered the four-order Enigma, thanks to codebooks retrieved from the sinking U-559, whose crew drowned, saving them. With that breakthrough, the British resumed reading German naval traffic almost in real time. The results were devastating. Dönitz had amassed the largest submarine fleet in history, minus 116 U-boats patrolling the Atlantic in wolf packs with names like Falk, MCU, and Stürmer. He believed victory was within reach. In his diary of May 1, 1943, he wrote, "The enemy is weakening. One more effort, and Britain's lifeline will be severed." But the British already knew everything. Convoy OS-5 departed Liverpool for Halifax on April 28, 1943, consisted of 42 merchant ships and was quickly spotted by U-650. Dönitz ordered 41 submarines to converge for the attack. Reading his signals, the British reinforced the convoy and rerouted additional escorts. The battle raged for 6 days across hundreds of miles. 13 merchant ships were lost, but at the cost of 7 others followed. U-192, depth charged by HMS Lut, U-638, ran by HMS Sunflower, U-125, U-531, U-438, U-630, U-528, all gone. For the first time in the war, the Allies were sinking submarines faster than the Germans could build them. By mid-May, the slaughter had become systematic. Convoys HX-237 and SC-130 destroyed 8 U-boats without losing a single ship. Hunter-killer groups guided by ultra-intercepts swept across the North Atlantic, catching U-boats at refueling points and along their approach routes. Aircraft equipped with new Lee lights exposed submarines surfacing at night, while ships armed with Hedgehog mortar decimated them underwater. The results were catastrophic. In May alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed, nearly a quarter of the fleet. Dönitz, recognizing the futility, issued the order that marked the end of the Battle of the Atlantic. All submarines were to withdraw from the North Atlantic and regroup farther south. In his war diary, he wrote simply, "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic." He blamed radar. He blamed aircraft. He blamed the weather. But never, not once, did he blame Enigma. Even as the wreckage of his fleet sank beneath the Atlantic waves, the thought that his own communications had orchestrated their deaths never crossed his mind. The most astonishing part of the Enigma story is not that the Allies broke it, but that they managed to keep it secret. For 5 years, Britain had access to the deepest thoughts of its enemies, yet acted with such restraint and precision that Germany never suspected. Winston Churchill, who received daily briefings from Bletchley Park, called the operation the goose that laid the golden eggs but never cackled. He understood that its power lay not merely in what was known, but in how carefully that knowledge was used. If the Germans ever realized that Enigma had been compromised, the war's greatest advantage would vanish overnight. Thus, the preservation of Ultra, the codename for all intelligence derived from broken Enigma traffic, became a second, silent war. Group Captain Frederick Winterboth, working under the direction of CIS Chief Stuart Menzies, designed an intricate system of secrecy and control. Beginning in 1940, a network known as the Special Liaison Units (SLUs) was formed. Small, hand-picked teams responsible for delivering ultra-intelligence to field commanders. Each officer was personally vetted by Winterbotham, sworn under the Official Secrets Act, and warned that a single breach, even after the war, would mean prosecution for treason. To most of the British military, Ultra didn't exist. Messages arrived in sealed envelopes marked only from a highly secret source. Even the recipients were forbidden to speculate where the intelligence came from. At Bletchley Park itself, paranoia was institutionalized. The sprawling estate, now a quiet museum, was then a fortress of secrecy. Military police guarded every gate. Inside, over 9,000 men and women worked in total compartmentalization. mathematicians, engineers, and typists, each performing a small, isolated task without ever glimpsing the full picture. In Hut 8, where naval Enigma was attacked under Alan Turing's direction, no one knew what was being done in Hut 6, which worked on Wehrmacht traffic. Even inside each hut, people were restricted to their specific function, decrypting, translating, or filing, never combining the parts. Many of the young women operating the bomb machines believed they were working on weather data or statistical research. To shield Ultra's existence, the British created layers of deception so convincing that even years later, some Allied officers still believed them. The earliest cover story was the invention of a mythical spy network known as Boniface. According to this fiction, an anti-Nazi German officer in Berlin was providing Britain with a steady stream of secret documents. The story was used so consistently that even senior military leaders referred to our man Boniface without irony. When the British acted on ultra-intelligence, they staged elaborate performances to make discoveries appear accidental. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately flown along routes that coincided with targets already revealed by giving the impression that the attacks resulted from aerial spotting rather than code breaking. After the British used Ultra to destroy an Italian convoy in the Mediterranean, they sent a radio message in a code they knew the Germans could read, thanking a brave agent in Naples for the information. The fictitious spy received many such acknowledgments throughout the war. But the deception wasn't just about fake stories, it was about restraint. Commanders were explicitly ordered not to act on ultra-intelligence unless a plausible cover existed. If an enemy convoy could not be attacked without exposing the secret, it was allowed to pass. This discipline was absolute, sometimes heartbreakingly so. By the time Dönitz issued his order in May 1943, withdrawing all submarines from the North Atlantic, the silent war of ciphers had already been decided. The Allies didn't just hunt the business, they hunted an entire way of thinking, a belief in unshakable certainty, and destroyed it without their enemies ever knowing. Hidden in the quiet countryside of Buckinghamshire, behind the ivy-covered walls of an English manor, stood the nerve center of the most secret operation of the war, Bletchley Park. To the outside world, it was merely a government research site. To those inside, it was the birthplace of modern computing, a place where thousands of minds joined together to dismantle what the Germans called unbreakable. By 1943, the work at Bletchley had evolved from a handful of mathematicians and linguists into a vast industrial complex of intelligence. What had begun as quiet calculation with pen, paper, and intuition had transformed into a machine-driven war fought in silence. It was here that the dream of breaking Enigma became a routine, a process so organized, so methodical, that the impossible became ordinary. The breakthrough began years earlier with the Polish Cipher Bureau, where three mathematicians, Marian Rejewski and Henryk Cygalski, had first unraveled Enigma's inner wiring using pure mathematics. Their discovery came from a tiny flaw in German procedure, the habit of sending each message, key twice at the start of a transmission. That repetition provided a pattern, and from that pattern, Rejewski had reconstructed the rotor wiring through an ingenious application of permutation theory. When Poland fell, in 1939, these discoveries were passed to Britain in secret, forming the foundation of everything that followed. But the British realized that human calculation alone could never keep pace with the volume of encrypted traffic pouring in daily. They needed machines that could think faster than any man. The first great leap came from Alan Turing, the young Cambridge mathematician whose name would later become synonymous with artificial intelligence. Working with engineer Gordon Welchman, he designed an electromechanical device known as the Bombe, a towering structure of rotating drums and wires that simulated multiple Enigma machines at once. The Bombe exploited a subtle quirk in Enigma's design. No letter could ever encode itself. By comparing encrypted messages against cribs, guessed pieces of plaintext such as Heil, Hitler, or weather report, the machine could eliminate impossible rotor settings at blinding speed. What once took days of hand calculation could now be achieved in hours. As Enigma evolved, so did the machines. When the Germans added a fourth rotor for their naval Enigma in 1942, the British fell into darkness for almost 10 months. Then, in a daring nighttime operation, sailors from HMS Petard boarded the sinking submarine U-559, retrieving vital codebooks before drowning in the attempt. With these, Bletchley Park could once again read German naval messages, and with that, the balance of the Atlantic War shifted permanently. But the British weren't finished. To attack more advanced ciphers, they built something entirely new, the world's first programmable electronic computer. Designed by Tommy Flowers, an engineer from the Post Office Research Station, the Colossus machine represented a revolution. Where the bombs used mechanical relays, Colossus used vacuum tubes minus 2,000 glowing valves that could process 5,000 characters per second. Each Colossus filled an entire room with a hum of electricity and heat. Operators, most of them women in uniform, worked in shifts, feeding punched tape through its readers, watching as patterns of light flickered across the panels, each flash representing a possibility being tested. The Germans would have called such a thing science fiction by 1944. Bletchley Park was no longer a secret laboratory, it was an intelligence factory. The site operated 24 hours a day in 3 continuous shifts. More than 9,000 people, 80% of them women, worked across the estate's ramshackle huts, deciphering, translating, indexing, and analyzing. Each message, once broken, passed through a precisely organized chain: transcription, decryption, verification, translation, and finally, delivery to the special liaison units, who carried the results to Allied command centers. Speed was everything. By late 1944, the average time between interception and deciphered intelligence had fallen to just 2.5 hours. The Allies were now reading German naval traffic almost in real time. Every element of the process was tracked and cross-referenced. Patterns were cataloged. Lazy operators who reused settings, predictable weather phrases, repetitive situation reports. Even the Germans' own code-breaking successes were turned against them. When the BDNs intercepted British convoy data and transmitted it through Enigma, the British already knew the convoy positions, giving them perfect cribs for attack. The Germans never imagined such a scale of operation. Their cryptanalysts, brilliant as they were, still worked like artisans: pencil, paper, and mechanical calculators. To them, code-breaking was an art form, a matter of insight and patience. When captured after the war, Dr. Erich Huttenheim, head of OKW, expressed sheer disbelief at what he learned. Impossible, he said, when told that Bletchley had been reading Enigma since 1940. When interrogators showed him the facilities, size, and machinery, he reportedly muttered, "No wonder. You treated cryptanalysis like mass production. We treated it like poetry." That was the essence of Ultra's success. Scale. The British had industrialized thought. Every breakthrough at Bletchley Park fed the others. Each decrypted message provided new cribs for tomorrow's intercepts. Every captured codebook shortened future searches. Every lazy operator's mistake became an entry in a master index that would later expose hundreds more. It was a feedback loop of brilliance and discipline, an early glimpse of what modern computation would become. By 1945, Bletchley Park had grown into the most efficient intelligence operation in history. The bombs, now more than 200 in number, churned endlessly. The Colossi, 10 in total by war's end, filled entire halls with their pulsing light. The air was thick with the smell of oil, ozone, and paper, and through it all, silence was maintained. Thousands of people worked on the greatest secret of the war, and not one of them spoke a word. The Germans had believed Enigma's 158 quintillion possible combinations placed it beyond human reach. They were right for humans, but not for the machines, and not for the thousands of minds who fed them. What had begun as a mathematical problem had become a fusion of human intuition and mechanical precision. It was the moment when humanity first learned to fight with logic itself. And while Admiral Dönitz commanded his submarines with pride, believing every message secure, Bletchley Park read his words, sometimes before his captains did. While the Allies built an empire of intelligence, the Germans were busy reinforcing their own delusion of invulnerability. The irony is almost tragic. The more evidence that pointed to a security breach, the more vigorously they insisted that none existed. From the beginning of the war, the Kriegsmarine and Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, had conducted periodic reviews of cipher security. Each time, the results reassured them and blinded them further. The first serious investigation came in the autumn of 1941, after a string of inexplicable convoy ambushes failed and several German supply ships were destroyed in the Atlantic. Captain Ludwig Stummel, the naval intelligence officer responsible for cipher analysis, compiled a detailed report. His conclusion: the British were using advanced radar and high-frequency direction, finding Huffduff to track you. The possibility of a cryptographic compromise was dismissed within 2 paragraphs. When U-570 fell into British hands that August, and U-110 had been captured months earlier, German analysts briefly considered the unthinkable. Could the Allies have recovered Enigma materials intact? The answer came from Stummel's office. Impossible. His logic was elegant but fatal. Enigma procedures required the destruction of all key lists before capture, and therefore, by definition, such a breach could not have occurred. In other words, German security was secure because German regulations said it was. Each time fresh evidence surfaced, a sudden convoy, a destroyed tanker, an ambushed wolf pack, German officers repeated the same mantra: radar, reconnaissance, chance, never codes. In 1943, as the Battle of the Atlantic turned into a bloodbath, the Naval High Command launched the most exhaustive internal investigation of the war. Led by Corvette Captain Mac, his report ran hundreds of pages and examined every technical angle: radar emissions, magnetic anomalies, weather interference, even the possibility of traitors. Once again, Enigma was exonerated. The most damning clue came from within the Wehrmacht itself. Late in 1942, the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, intercepted a coded message sent from Berlin to Madrid. To their horror, it returned garbled. Yet, when retransmitted using slightly altered settings, it went through perfectly. The discrepancy suggested that the British were manipulating the communication channels or possibly reading them. The report reached Admiral Karl, head of the Abwehr, who raised concerns about code security. He was quietly ignored and later executed for unrelated reasons. The Luftwaffe had its own warnings. After the devastating Battle of El Alamein, German air commanders were bewildered at how precisely British forces anticipated every movement of their convoys and airlifts. In Tunisia, General Hans Jeschonek concluded that British aerial reconnaissance must have improved dramatically. In his final report before his suicide in 19, he wrote, "We have been betrayed not by traitors but by technology." In Berlin, that phrase became doctrine, but the Germans were not entirely without clues. A remarkable warning came not from within the Reich but from neutral Switzerland. In late 1942, Swiss cryptographers working for the firm Crypto, which sold encryption devices to various governments, noticed unusual patterns in intercepted access in Allied traffic. Their lead analyst, Hans Buller, deduced that German codes might not be as invincible as claimed. Reports were quietly sent to Berlin through diplomatic channels, suggesting the possibility that Enigma's structure was mathematically vulnerable. The response was silence. There were other signs, flickers of light, on the horizon that no one wanted to see. The Lucy spy ring, based in neutral Switzerland and run by the mysterious Rudolf Ross, provided the Soviet Union with military intelligence so precise that Stalin's generals often received German operational plans within hours of their drafting. German counterintelligence, unable to believe that such speed could come from espionage alone, suspected a mole inside the high command. In truth, many of Lucy's sources were ultra-decrypts passed to Moscow through Swiss intermediaries. Had Berlin realized this, the entire illusion would have shattered, but they didn't because it violated their core belief. That Enigma was unbreakable. That belief became a kind of national theology, reinforced by mathematics, hierarchy, and pride. The German scientific establishment had calculated that even if an enemy possessed an Enigma machine, reconstructing the daily key settings would take hundreds of years. Therefore, if their logic was sound, the enemy's success must be impossible, and if it was impossible, then it could not be happening. This circular reasoning, part intellectual arrogance, part psychological necessity, insulated them from reality, even when Admiral Dönitz himself ordered repeated inquiries into the growing U-boat disasters. His subordinates produced technical explanations that comforted him. Metox detectors radiating signals, infrared detection by aircraft, centimetric radar beyond comprehension. The theories grew, increasingly elaborate, all designed to preserve the myth of Enigma's perfection. To Dönitz, the thought that his own orders were being read by the enemy was more unbearable than defeat itself. He had built his entire career on the precision of communication, the synchronization of hundreds of submarines across the vast Atlantic. To admit that this lifeline had been compromised from the beginning would have been to confess that the Krieg's most trusted weapon had been turned against it, so he didn't. None of them did, even when captured German officers during the war's final months were interrogated by the Allies and told directly that their ciphers had been read for years. Most refused to believe it. Dr. Huttenheim himself, when confronted in 1945 with evidence from Bletchley Park, insisted that any such success must have been temporary or accidental. The idea of systematic code-breaking was beyond his imagination. The German failure wasn't a failure of mathematics or engineering. It was a failure of imagination. The evidence had been everywhere. The captured submarines, the impossible ambushes, the Allied precision. But for a nation that saw logic as invincible, the possibility that emotion, intuition, guesswork, and creative reasoning could triumph over pure science was inconceivable. By the time the war drew to a close, their blindness had cost them the seas, the skies, and finally, the war itself. And so, when Admiral Dönitz sat reading the ultra-secret in 1974, decades later, in quiet disbelief, he wasn't just discovering that his codes had been broken. He was discovering that his mind, like his machines, had been trapped by its own perfection. The illusion of security had been the most dangerous cipher of all. By 1942, Bletchley Park's secret war was no longer Britain's alone. As the global conflict widened, so too did the reach of the codebreakers. The Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and now the Pacific, all became theaters of invisible warfare, fought through circuits and ciphers. And at the heart of it, the Ultra Network began to merge with a new and rising partner, the United States. The Americans had entered the war late, but they brought with them something the British desperately needed: scale. What the United Kingdom had achieved through intellect and discipline, the United States could now multiply through industrial power. In Washington, a sprawling facility known as Arlington Hall was rapidly converted from a girls' school into the headquarters of the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service, SIS, led by a quiet, brilliant mathematician named William F. Friedman. Across the Potomac, the Navy established its own cryptanalytic division at OP-20G, housed inside the old munitions building. Together, these organizations became America's mirror to Bletchley Park. Parallel worlds. Connected by the flow of intercepted signals, the two sides shared a common goal: to break the codes of the Axis powers and turn their own messages into weapons against them. At first, cooperation between London and Washington was hesitant. British secrecy was legendary, and Ultra was their crown jewel, one they were reluctant to share. The Americans, meanwhile, had cracked Japanese systems on their own, including the formidable purple cipher used by the Japanese Foreign Office. That success earned them credibility. And slowly, the doors to Bletchley Park opened up. By 1943. The alliance had become formalized under an extraordinary agreement known as the Brusa Accord. It established the first true transatlantic intelligence partnership, defining not only how information would be shared, but how it would be protected. Under Brusa, raw intercepts were exchanged daily. American cryptanalysts gained access to ultra-decrypts, while British analysts were given insight into U.S. progress against Japanese systems. Secure communication channels known as Special Liaison Units, SLUs, were set up in Washington, London, Cairo, and later, Pearl Harbor. Each was equipped with the same cipher machinery, so messages could be transmitted in complete secrecy between nations. This collaboration changed the rhythm of the war. Intelligence no longer moved in national silos. It became global, instantaneous, industrial. The Americans, with their immense resources, began to replicate the British model on a staggering scale. Where Bletchley Park had hundreds of bombs, the U.S. built thousands. At Dayton, Ohio, engineers at the National Cash Register Company, led by Joseph Daesh, constructed more than 120 of the improved American bombs, faster, quieter, and capable of working on multiple rotor orders. Simultaneously, the results were transformative. By mid, Allied command could read the majority of German and Japanese communications within hours of transmission. Ultra-intelligence wasn't merely supplementing the war effort, it was steering it. Convoys, air raids, even strategic bombing targets were chosen based on decrypted signals. Across the Atlantic, American cryptanalysts achieved parallel miracles in the Pacific theater, working from Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor and from All in Melbourne. They broke the Japanese naval code JN25, revealing the positions and plans of entire fleets. It was Ultra-Specific Twin, the system that would soon lead to one of the most decisive battles in naval history. Midway. In May 1942, US codebreakers under Commander Joseph Rochefort intercepted Japanese messages indicating that an operation was planned against a target codenamed AF. Rochefort suspected A meant Midway Island, but to prove it, he devised a trap. He ordered the Midway garrison to transmit an uncoded message stating that the island's freshwater condenser had broken down. Hours later, a Japanese transmission reported that AF is short of water. The proof was irrefutable. Armed with that knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz ambushed the Japanese fleet on June 4, 1942. For enemy carriers, Kagesoryo and Hiryu were destroyed. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. All because of an intercepted message and a single act of deception. What Bletchley Park had done to Dönitz's U-boat, Arlington Hall, and Station HYPO, had now done to Yamamoto's fleet. But the Allied codebreakers didn't only share data, they shared philosophy. Where German cryptography was bound by bureaucracy and mathematical certainty, Anglo-American codebreaking thrived on creativity, experimentation, and intuition. The work was filled with contradictions, rigorous procedure guided by flashes of imagination. Alan Turing himself visited the U.S. in 1943, traveling to Washington and Dayton to assist in improving the bomb design. The Americans marveled at his ability to reduce vast problems into elegant logic. He, in turn, admired their manufacturing efficiency. Together, they represented two halves of a new kind of warfare. One fought not with guns, but with minds and machines. As the alliance deepened, the Ultra Network expanded into the world's first truly global intelligence web. Messages intercepted in Cairo could be decrypted in London, analyzed in Washington, and relayed to the Pacific, all in less than a day. The very concept of global signals intelligence, which would define the Cold War decades later, was born in these exchanges. Even Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, was guided by German troop movements, fuel shipments, and defense reinforcements were all tracked through decrypted traffic. The Allies knew which divisions were in Normandy and which were still waiting in Calais. They even learned that Hitler had refused to release armored reserves on June 6, because he believed Normandy was only a diversion, a deception reinforced by counterintelligence. Every level of the war, land, sea, and air now moved according to the rhythm of the invisible symphony played by the cryptanalysts. By the time victory came in 1945, the secret alliance between Bletchley Park and its American counterparts had laid the foundation for a new world order. When peace returned, both nations recognized that the machinery of secrecy could not simply be dismantled. It had become too essential. The cooperation born in the crucible of war evolved into permanent institutions. Britain's GCHQ and America's NSA, the encrypted cables between London and Washington never stopped humming. Global web, that began as a desperate experiment in wartime survival, had quietly become the architecture of the modern intelligence world. And though the public would not know it for decades, every modern spy satellite, every intercepted signal, every whisper caught in the ether traced its lineage back to the same modest English mansion and the quiet men and women who, in 1940, decided that no code was truly unbreakable. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, a strange kind of war continued, a war not of nations, but of silence. The men and women of Bletchley Park had helped win the greatest conflict in history, yet they were forbidden to speak of it. For them, victory brought not celebration, but secrecy. The world cheered the soldiers, the pilots, the admirals, and the generals. But those who had fought the invisible war, the mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and clerks who had lived among wires and whispers, simply disappeared into ordinary life. Their mission was over. Their secret was not. Within weeks of Germany's surrender, the British government began dismantling the machinery of Ultra, the massive bomb and Colossus machines that had once filled entire halls with their humming power were quietly dismantled with hammers and saws. Some were destroyed completely. Others were disassembled into scrap to ensure that no trace of their existence remained. Technicians were ordered to burn punch tapes, code logs, and even the paper ribbons that had carried intercepted signals. Nothing was to survive. Those who had worked at Bletchley were summoned, one by one, to sign renewed copies of the Official Secrets Act. It was made clear that the order was absolute. They were told they could not speak of what they had done, not to friends, not to family, not even to each other. The threat was explicit. Disclosure would be considered treason. And so, the people who had helped shape the modern world vanished back into it. A young woman who had operated a Colossus machine might return home and take a job as a mathematician who had cracked German naval traffic would go back to academia, never mentioning the war years in his lectures. For decades, the world knew nothing. The official histories of the Second World War told stories of radar, sonar, and brave reconnaissance pilots, never of commanders like Admiral Cunningham, Eisenhower, and Montgomery publicly attributed their foresight to experience and intuition. The true source, Ultra, remained hidden behind a wall of classified files marked most secret in many ways. This secrecy served its purpose. The lessons of Bletchley Park were too valuable to share in a world sliding rapidly into the Cold War. The methods developed there, the interception of global communications, the analysis of massive data, the use of machines to extract patterns, became the backbone of the new intelligence age. Britain's Government Communications Headquarters (GCHQ) inherited Bletchley's mantle, while in America, Arlington Hall and OP20G evolved into the National Security Agency, NSA. Together, they formed the first peacetime intelligence alliance, a direct descendant of the wartime Ultra partnership. But for the thousands who had lived through it, the silence became a kind of imprisonment. Some carried the burden with quiet pride. Others struggled. The mathematician Gordon Welch, one of Turing's closest collaborators, later said, "We had to live with a double life, the one the world saw, and the one we could never talk about." Alan Turing, who had built the intellectual foundation of Bletchley Park's triumph, suffered in silence more than most. After the war, his work continued briefly at the National Physical Laboratory, where he proposed a revolutionary design for a universal computing machine, what would one day be recognized as the first digital computer. But his contributions to code-breaking remained classified. When he was prosecuted in 1952 for his homosexuality, still a crime in Britain, not even his war record could be publicly mentioned in his defense. He died 2 years later, unrecognized, his legacy buried under layers of secrecy. Meanwhile, the myth of German superiority in technology persisted. The narrative of Enigma, the unbreakable machine, became a symbol of lost genius rather than fatal arrogance. For the German veterans who survived, it was easier to believe that they had been defeated by industrial might or radar, not by the invisible minds of mathematicians working in an English country estate. Even the Allies' own commanders were kept in ignorance of the full truth. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had received ultra-intelligence daily during his campaigns in North Africa, later admitted, "I never knew where the information came from. I thought it was from spies. That was by design." Only a handful of senior figures, Churchill, Eisenhower, and a few others, ever knew the word ultra. The secrecy endured longer than the war itself. In the 1950s, when historians began publishing the first official accounts of the Battle of the Atlantic and the North African Campaign, the role of code-breaking was deliberately omitted. The reason was not vanity, but necessity. Enigma machines were still being used. After the war, hundreds of surplus Enigmas were sold or given to friendly nations, including in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, which had no idea their communications were readable by London and Washington. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, British and American intelligence quietly intercepted and decrypted diplomatic traffic from countries still relying on secure German encryption. Ultra lived on, disguised as routine interception. Only in 1974, when Group Captain F.W. Winterbotham, one of the wartime organizers of the Ultra Distribution Network, published his memoir, The Ultra Secret, did the truth finally emerge. The British government attempted to suppress it but relented. The Cold War world had changed enough for partial disclosure. The revelation sent shockwaves through the military and academic communities. Veterans who had never spoken of their service could finally tell their stories. Historians were forced to rewrite entire chapters of the Second World War, and somewhere in Germany, Admiral Karl Dönitz, then 83 years old, sat reading the book that revealed how deeply his fleet had been compromised. For 3 decades, he had believed the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost to technology and luck. Now he understood that every message, every patrol order, every desperate plea for supplies had been read by his enemies, often before his own officers received them. He lived out his final years quietly, haunted by that knowledge. The silence of Bletchley Park had lasted almost 30 years. When it finally ended, it reshaped our understanding not just of the war, but of intelligence itself, from beneath the battles and the politics. The story of Ultra was a story of human minds, of how imagination could defeat machines, and how secrecy could protect both victory and truth. The war had been won with words and wires as much as with bullets and bombs, and the greatest triumph of all had been the one nobody knew. In the end, the war against Enigma was more than a battle of cryptography. It was the dawn of a new world. The victory that began with gears, rotors, and cables would give birth to something larger than anyone at Bletchley Park could have imagined: the digital age. When the war ended, most of Bletchley's machines were dismantled, their blueprints destroyed under orders of secrecy. Yet the ideas that powered them, the logic of automation, the concept of programmable computation, the marriage of mathematics and machinery could not be unlearned. They had already escaped into the minds of those who built them. Among them was Alan Turing, the quiet, brilliant mathematician whose theoretical imagination had made the bomb possible. Long before the war, he had written of a hypothetical device, a universal machine capable of performing any calculation given enough time and instructions. At Bletchley Park, that theory became tangible. The bombs and the Colossus machines proved that thought could be mechanized. In 1945, just months after the war's end, Turing presented a paper titled Proposed Electronic Calculator. It described, in essence, the modern computer complete with stored memory, a central processing unit, and an architecture that could handle both data and instructions. The design anticipated what would later be known as the von Neumann architecture, forming the conceptual backbone of all digital computers to come. Though his proposal was not immediately built, Turing's wartime logic had already inspired others. Tommy Flowers, who had constructed the Colossus, applied his experience with vacuum tubes to post-war telecommunication systems. Max Newman, another Bletchley mathematician, went on to establish the Manchester Computing Laboratory, where the first true stored program computer, the Manchester Baby, ran in 1948. In the United States, similar seeds had taken root. American engineers who had worked alongside British cryptanalysts during the war brought their experience back to research centers like Bell Labs, Harvard, and MIT. The lineage of the modern mainframe, from ENIAC to IBM, can be traced directly to the logic and urgency of Bletchley Park, but the legacy of Enigma extended far beyond technology. It reshaped the entire philosophy of intelligence and warfare. Before Ultra, military power had been defined by physical strength, tanks, ships, armies. After Ultra, it became clear that knowledge itself could be a weapon, often more decisive than any bomb. The ability to see the enemy's mind, to read his intentions, had changed the meaning of strategy forever. This realization gave birth to the modern intelligence state, the agencies founded in the war's aftermath. Britain's GCHQ, America's NSA, and their Commonwealth counterparts were not simply bureaucracies. They were the heirs of Bletchley Park. They were built upon the principle that victory depended not on secrecy of action, but on mastery of information. The post-war years saw that principle evolve into an arms race of code and countercode. Encryption and decryption became permanent fixtures of national defense. The early Cold War was fought not only with nuclear weapons, but with listening stations, satellite intercepts, and global communication monitoring, all descendants of Bletchley's intercept rooms. Even the digital surveillance systems of the 21st century, from cyber espionage to internet encryption, trace their conceptual ancestry to those wartime huts filled with cables, typewriters, and paper reels. Yet, at its core, the legacy of Enigma is not one of machines, but of minds. It is a story about imagination. The ability to see beyond what logic insists is impossible. The Germans had mathematics. They had order, precision, and belief in the unassailable perfection of their systems. What they lacked was imagination, the capacity to think like the enemy, to anticipate irrationality, to see patterns where none seemed to exist. The British and their allies, by contrast, had cultivated creativity as their greatest weapon. They filled Bletchley Park with poets, chess champions, crossword enthusiasts, and eccentric scholars, people who saw connections where others saw chaos. That unlikely mix of intellect and intuition cracked the uncrackable. Alan Turing once wrote that we can only see a short distance ahead, but we can see plenty there that needs to be done. He never lived to see how much his short distance would stretch. The technology born from his war, once used to break ciphers, would soon carry mankind to the moon, connect continents through invisible networks, and give birth to the information age. And yet, the same tools that once saved civilization now raise profound questions about it. The digital machines that arose from the ruins of Enigma gave humanity unprecedented power to compute, to communicate, and to control. But they also created a new frontier of vulnerability. A world where information itself could be weaponized. It is a paradox worthy of Bletchley Park's mathematicians. The very logic that once protected freedom now governs the systems that can endanger it. Today, in the glow of our screens and the hum of our servers, the spirit of that hidden war still lingers. Every encrypted message, every password, every line of computer code owes something to the race that began in 1939, when a handful of men and women set out to prove that no machine, no matter how perfect, could outthink the human mind. The Enigma had been built to guarantee silence. Instead, it gave birth to a world that would never stop talking. In the end, the story of Enigma was never just about machines, codes, or intelligence. It was about people, fragile, brilliant, ordinary people caught between the noise of war and the silence of secrecy. The machines themselves are gone now. The bombs were dismantled, the colossi broken into pieces. The rotors of Enigma lie behind museum glass, their metal dull and still. Yet what they represented, the triumph of the human mind over its own inventions, endures. History often remembers the victors of battles, the generals whose names fill textbooks, the leaders whose speeches echo through time. But the real victory of the Second World War was written not on the front lines, but in cramped huts filled with cigarette smoke, cold tea, and the endless clicking of typewriters. That it was won by a generation that believed thinking could save the world. At Bletchley Park, they called themselves clerks, analysts, typists, anything but heroes. Many of them were barely out of university. Some were barely out of school. They worked 16-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Their world reduced to paper, wires, and the relentless rhythm of incoming signals. Each message was a puzzle, each solution a small act of resistance against tyranny. They lived without recognition, and most died without it. Alan Turing, whose ideas gave the modern world its electronic heartbeat, never saw his name honored in his lifetime. Condemned not for his secrets but for who he was, he ended his life in silence. Decades later, the nation that had once branded him a criminal would apologize, call him a hero, and place his face on its currency, a symbol of the mind that saw too far ahead of its time. Others lived to see the truth finally surface. The women who had operated the bombs, once dismissed as mere assistants, were recognized as pioneers of computing. The engineers who built Colossus realized that they had unknowingly created the ancestor of every digital machine that would follow. The mathematicians who thought they were fighting a temporary war discovered that they had, in fact, defined a permanent one, the war for information. And what of the other side? In a small home near Hamburg, Admiral Karl Dönitz spent his final years surrounded by silence of a different kind. The once commanding voice that had ruled the Atlantic now echoed only in memory. The book that exposed the ultra secret, lay on his desk, its pages underlined, its margins filled with terse notes and questions. It had taken him 30 years to realize that his fleet had never truly been his own. Every order he gave had passed through invisible hands, every maneuver watched by unseen eyes. In the margins of the chapter on naval Enigma, he scribbled just 3 words, Das or Ales. That was everything. He died in 1980, still unable to comprehend how mathematics, imagination, and machinery had combined to undo his empire beneath the waves. The irony is almost poetic. Dönitz's Germany had worshipped the machine, precision, order, perfection. Yet it was the human element, the very thing the Nazis sought to subordinate to their mechanical ideal, that defeated them. It was the chaos of creativity, the intuition of a linguist, the guess of a crosswords, the defiance of a scientist that broke their perfect order. The legacy of Enigma, then, is not the machine itself, but the reminder that every invention reflects the soul of its creator. A cipher is a mirror. It hides truth through logic, but it can also reveal the limits of that logic. The Germans built Enigma to protect their secrets. The Allies built machines to understand it and, in doing so, discovered the blueprint of the digital future. From that paradox was born the age we live in now, an age where every phone, every satellite, every network carries the same duality, the power to connect and the power to conceal. The heirs of Bletchley Park's secret war now operate not in huts, but in data centers. Their code not printed on paper, but pulsing through light. Yet the question remains, the same the one that haunted the war rooms then and the computer labs now. Will our machines serve humanity, or will humanity serve its machines? Perhaps that is why the story of Enigma continues to matter. It reminds us that behind every algorithm, behind every encryption, behind every glowing screen, there is still a human face, curious, flawed, determined, and capable of both creation and destruction. That face was there at Bletchley Park. It was there in the cockpit of a U-boat, in the radio room of a destroyer, in the flicker of a Colossus valve. It is there now, in the reflection of every device that traces its ancestry back to that secret war. The machines may have changed. The code has not,